Namaste, and welcome to Acharya Shunya's podcast, Shadow to Self, a show created to inspire you to step out of fear and darkness into a place of freedom and empowerment. In each episode, she'll explore humanity's deepest questions about your relationship with yourself and others, illuminated by the ancient and non-dual wisdom of the Vedas, Upanishads, and Bhagavad Gita. Keep listening.
Hello, Shadow to Self community, and I am back. Today, I have a special guest with me, Rabbi Matthew Ponak, and just in a minute, I will let him introduce himself to you, but I want to tell you why he is my guest. Not only because he's a rabbi, he's a mystic, and he has all this knowledge that I want to learn about and I want to share with you, but because I was so attracted by his smile, and I was attracted by how he presented ancient mystical Kabbalah to the people here and now. So from that perspective, I found him as a soul friend because, this is what I try to do. I do not dilute the knowledge, but I try to make it accessible and sensible to our era so that it can be applied here and now. And when I saw Rabbi Matthew doing that, I found a spirit of kinship between him and I. And so what caught my attention really was not his polish or poetry. It was a clarity that was rooted in the mystical dimensions of the Kabbalah. And he was not speaking from outside, but from within, through his own practice. And he didn't feel the need to be anything different from who he is. And that is something I really appreciated. So I recognize when someone else is carrying the responsibility of making teachings accessible to modern students without thinning them out. I really respect that. So Matthew, welcome to Shadow to Self.
Thank you so much, Acharya Shunya. It's great to be here.
And I was wondering that instead of me introducing you in formal terms, because I've done that in my other bios, and I get so stiff suddenly reading from a script, it's really better to invite a living, embodied person carrying an ancient tradition to speak for themselves. So why don't you tell our speakers a little bit about yourself and what feels alive for you right now?
Absolutely. I am someone who considers myself to be a student of world wisdom. And it was in pursuing that in the most universal sense when I was in my 20s that I felt this call to return to the tradition I had been raised in, to Judaism, and to learn and become a lineage holder in that, to become a rabbi. I really saw myself at that point as purely a universalist. So this experience where I felt like I was being turned back towards my roots was very jarring. And it took me a number of years to really try it out and to say yes to it. But what I ended up discovering is that so many of the things I valued most deeply in my own spiritual life and spiritual journey up to that point, I was finding hidden in these largely sparse and unknown texts. Some of them were untranslated. And the more I gained access, the more I realized that there was this treasure that had been waiting in the very place where I was most reluctant to explore. So as a universalist who has the kind of training that I got, which is primarily a scholar, but a leader of ritual and prayer experiences, a connector, a communicator, I find ways to participate in the universal conversations from drawing from that Jewish well. And in the same way that I've learned from so many different traditions and teachers from different places who were just teaching anyone that was sincere, that's how I approach what I do. I really appreciate what you said about being able to communicate the depths of a lineage without watering it down. That's a very fine art. It's a very advanced form of dance in a way, but it's something that's so needed, because if something's really going to serve, it needs to be coming both from a place of authenticity and truth, and be relayed in a way that it meets people where they are.
Authenticity, truth, and then you spoke about being a universalist, and probably that is why both of us were keynote speakers at the Theosophical Annual Conference in Wheaton, Illinois. And what a right setting for us to meet.
For sure.
And I guess probably that is what our deeper traditions, our respective traditions, are teaching us, aren't they? Because we were just discussing earlier about how there is the concept of a universal reality that is attributeless. And that doesn't mean it's less of anything. That means it's so inclusive that any one attribute can limit us to that attribute. So it's not yellow, because then it cannot be blue. It's not wet, because then it cannot be dry. And that ultimate reality, that ultimate divine truth, is so all inclusive. And therefore, it is universal in our tiny human context. And the Vedas call it Brahman. And as I'm beginning to just enter into the Kabbalah and learn about it or research about it, then I heard about the Ein Sof. And of course, you will pronounce it more correctly. And let's talk about that. Let's begin with what's universal, shall we?
Right. We'll begin with the endless. So Ein Sof, you could literally translate as without end or infinite. It is the indescribable essence of all that is. And somewhere it shows up in perceptible and imperceptible ways. But it's literally impossible to narrow down, to pinpoint, to grasp physically, emotionally, mentally in its true essence, but it's always here.
That is so beautiful, that which is endless. And so Brahman in the Upanishads, in Advaita Vedanta, is defined as that which is boundless, that which is limitless. And Sat, Chit, Ananda are the three terms that we use. And Sat is existence that is neither starting nor ending. It's the isness, the beingness. Mm-hmm. And Chit is consciousness or intelligence that is unvarying. So that's the underlying awareness within us. It's not the awareness of a pen or the awareness of a cup. It is bottom line Chit. It's conscious, it's intelligence. And then it is also by its nature, not as an add-on, but it is joyful, and any connection with it is joyful. So having this limitless, endless, boundless reality as a foundation of our traditions, does that make the Kabbalah also a unifying mystic tradition? Does it find unity in diversity, literally and symbolically within us? How does that play out on your end?
I love this question because it causes me to think about it in a different way than I normally have it framed. And it sounds like you're asking because the essence, the true reality in the Kabbalistic understanding of what's really going on here, because that essence is unified and also the source of diversity, does that mean that we are too in our essence? Something about multiplicity and unity. The way that I would like to answer that is to say so much of Kabbalah comes down to balance. And this notion that when we journey deeper in our spiritual practices, in our encounter with deeper layers of reality, there's often a journey towards unification, towards connection, and away from this world of dispersed entities that we find ourselves in normally. And at the same time, there's a real honoring of the differentiation and the multiplicity, because in order to fully show up in our world, from my tradition's perspective, we'd have to say you need to know who you are. And that is not necessarily the same as needing to know who you are in your very most essential self, in your soul, but who are you? Do you have a place in this world? What's your purpose? And so there's a kind of embrace of holy differences, both in spiritual journeys and in how they're lived out in action, because each of us is distinct and we have parts in ourselves that surface, and a simultaneous awareness of the value and the importance and the state of mind that we can be graced with, which shows us that actually we're all one. We're all humans. We're all existence.
So I love the emphasis upon not just the unity, which if we only, it's not possible to live only in a state of homogeneous unity. The separation is a reality. And then there is light apparently shown on that multiplicity to then discover greater consciousness. Am I correct in that understanding?
Yeah, that everything in a sense is a gateway.
Is a gateway
to what lies beyond. That our tradition, so Kabbalah arises out of Judaism, and the Jewish people are a tribe that have been, identifying as in this way. Today, you might call us more of an ethno-religion or something like that. But in essence, we are a tribe, a group of connected people who have mystical varieties and mystical teachings that we've expressed in different eras. And one of them from the Middle Ages is called Kabbalah. So because it's arising out of this culture and this group of people, there's not always such a great distinction between the mystical forms and our core values. So we really value connecting to the everyday as part of who we are. And that means in order for our mystical lineages to really be able to relate to that part of who we are, part of the teaching really is we don't need to avoid the world in order to see the multiplicity as a gateway. That everything we do, every conversation, every walk we take, every moment, whether ritual or, so to speak, mundane, is part of a spiritual life if we have that intention.
I think that leads me to the contemplation of the householder's path of spirituality. In the Vedas too, at some point, renunciation and separation from everyday life became glamorous. And we have some prominent examples of it. For example, the Buddha. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just mentioning some successful separations. They were done from Dharma, they were lived in Dharma, but it is not for the average person to do that. The average person, and I include myself in that average mentality, for us, the goal was to be spiritually ascendant as a householder, as an everyday person. A householder doesn't mean in our tradition one who has a partner or domesticity necessarily, but somebody who lives within the forest of everyday existence. And that is why our sages and seers were either married or they had lovers or they were very much within the world. And yet they knew of Brahman. Yet they would regard that Brahman by any name that that ultimate reality as their goal, and there was no separation. And the invitation was to live from that unbreakable, indivisible wholeness as these separate beings. And it does something interesting. You don't have to deny your this world while you dwell in the mystical possibility of who are you really deep down, and what is that unity that connects you and connects even those aspects of your everyday reality which you shun and push away. So the tension was resolved by knowingness, by knowledge of the wholeness while leading a separate life. How is tension resolved in the Kabbalah between who we actually are, or our ultimate reality, and the shadow, where we are when we become reduced? And sometimes the problem with separation is that we can separate all the way to becoming a dysfunctional, disconnected, even from ourselves, our truth. So how is this resolved in your teaching specifically? We want to come to that. And then in the Kabbalah in general.
Yeah. Well, just to say, first of all, Shunya, one of the things that I was really drawn to when I met you at the conference this summer in Wheaton, Illinois, with the Theosophical Society was I love that you're coming from a household or lineage, that there is a stereotype that I have seen in various places and traditions that, as you say, there's something revered, more revered, better inherently about being a renunciate than being a householder, about walking in the world with no possessions and being part of a only spiritual life. But where you're coming from is where I'm coming from. In many ways, what you just said is how I explain what is Jewish mysticism. Constantly, I have to say something like that because it's out of context for a lot of people. But I just think it's amazing that you're coming from a very similar set of values or lifestyle about the integration of physicality and spirituality from where you're deriving your lineage. So specifically, if I were to give one of the also things I've noticed when speaking with teachers such as yourself who are learned in traditions like Vedas, is there tends to be a kind of philosophical clarity on ways that maybe it's the way it's being relayed, but I get the sense that there has been work to clarify principles in a way, in an unbroken lineage sense, which because of my people's history, we don't have unbroken lineages that last very long. We tend to have lots of interruptions along the way because of our diaspora experience. But I'm going to give some answers, and these will be coming from a combination of my learning and the tradition, but we don't generally have agreed upon principles in such a way. So it's one of the interesting differences between from what I've picked up from people, for example, speaking from the Vedic or Buddhist traditions. Mm-hmm. When the shadow arises, which is for anyone who is having their eyes open or their heart open, that happens every day, perhaps every hour. It's very hard to live in this world without realizing the depths of your humanity. And I also including myself in that very much as an average person who makes mistakes. So one of the principles that is taught is, it's a Hebrew phrase, and I'll say it briefly and then explain it. Yerida letzorech aliyah. Literally, it means going down for the sake of coming up. And it's an orientation to practice. There are times when it's advisable not to stare into the void, not to dance with the shadow, because there's other things going on that we should be doing. For example, it's good to rest sometimes. It's good to take care of responsibilities before going deep into our the twists and the knots in our souls and minds. But when we choose to do that, it's a perspective that's also a promise. It's like, don't worry. There's an end to the tunnel. Face that which arises, that which is painful or difficult or confusing, and walk into that. You can have this sense of trust in that process. And through healthy successful engagement that's not too light or too overwhelming. And you can actually meet that shadow side and realize there's something of a spark there. There's something holy there. And that part of us that we were judging or that mistake we couldn't get over turns out to be an opportunity. And through that ascension, after we go down, we come up, the hope is we can rise higher than where we were in the first place.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So, Matthew, for me, or rather in Advaita Vedanta, when something like a shadow is clearly seen, take your time and you just see it, right? It's a matter of perception. And when it is clearly seen, and ultimately what we see are the distortions, then it stops controlling you. So our seeing with knowledge restores our freedom back to us. So how do you as a teacher of the Kabbalah, and with the book that you've written on this, is it how do you pronounce it? It's very
well. I have two books. One is Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People, and that's a collection of primary teachings with translations and explanations that have to do with a lot of transformation and groundedness and the body-spirit connection. And the other book that came out more recently is called The Path of the Sefirot. And that Sefirot, and those are somewhere between us and infinity are the Sefirot. They are the levels and the layers in the spiritual realm. And they have personalities and light sides and shadow sides. So
yeah, that you mentioned that earlier to me. Yes. Talk about that. And is there a way to access these levels of the Sephirot or in our own shadow work? Or how do you actually make that a tool for us in the here and now? Because we're dealing with all of us, all of humanity is really in this journey between the shadow to the truth, to the light.
So I'll lay things out maybe in two or three ways. One of them is conceptually. So there are 10 Sefirot. Sefirot is plural, Sephirah is singular. And a good translation might be divine emanation. Or I've heard rabbis call them gods and goddesses, actually. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we're such a kind of a strict monotheist tradition in our origins, but there's something to be said about the overlap between the Sefirot that have their own divine names and their own missions and purposes and places. And so examples might be Chesed is loving kindness. And Gevura means power, but it has to do with boundaries and strictness. And the word no. Tiferet is like a balance, harmonizing principle between those. And it also has to do with compassion or true compassion, because it's not actually compassionate to say yes all the time or simply to feel what others are feeling and ignoring yourself. So there's all of these. So there's 10 of these realms or levels, depending on how you're understanding them. And an example of, let's say, conceptually, the word yes, giving, charity, when that's aligned, think about it as a pure divine quality. What does it mean to give without expectation of receiving? What does it mean to give as the universe gives, freely, as the tree gives, just wafting scent into space? That's chesed. It's love for love's sake and love alone. That's what you could call an integrated, an aligned expression of it. But in our world, as householders, we know that sometimes people want things from us that it wouldn't be wise to give them. I have kids. I have a wife. They rely to some degree on my income. And if I gave all of my earnings away or never took any payment for my work, that might be loving in a sense, but it wouldn't be aligned. That's a shadow variety of chesed. It's when it gets removed from the balance. And the balance on the other side is boundaries, is gevura, that power, that strength, that fierceness. And perhaps listeners can imagine what happens when we have only fierceness, only no, and no yes. There's something of a harmony that's required there. So every quality like this, just conceptually speaking, can go either way. When
I
we're
really
talking,
like that. Yeah. In my book, Sovereign Self, I have talked about this newfangled fascination for absolutism in good values, like even nonviolence. If you keep applying nonviolence, you are left boundaryless. But it became this almost like a banner line for the Indian tradition, especially after Gandhi and the Buddha. But in the Vedas, the Hindu gods and goddesses have these blessing hands, or they're holding the lotus and they have multiple hands to show their multiple powers. But at the back, they're holding swords and hammers and, bow and arrows to protect against ignorance and evil. So there's always this balance, the word you're using, between different aspects. And sometimes when violence is used appropriately and judiciously with discrimination and discernment, it may be what is needed for evolution. Similarly, compassion. If we only use compassion, and that is what was happening to Arjuna, he was in false compassion for his 100 cousins who had been abusing him and his brothers all along, usurped their kingdom, molested their wife, disrespected them at every level. And here he was feeling a compassion out of some kind of false goodness. And Krishna, our avatar, says, wake up. This is not compassion. This is foolishness. This is delusion. This is an illusion that you are coming into. And so what you have to come into is right thinking, right, and through balance of when is what appropriate. And this is a more mature response, I would say, than a pure application of the value. That's easy. I'm going to choose a right position or a left position, and then God help me. I'm not going to move from there. But it seems like the Kabbalah, in my understanding now, is really representing these gods and goddesses, or these entities, or these symbols of these 10 symbols, really as their dark and bright side, as teachings for us then of living in this beautiful balance. It can be really applied in the here and now, is what I'm understanding, and I'm appreciating it, Rabbi Matthew.
Yeah, and life is not simple.
No.
And it requires a flowing equilibrium, a sense of, now what do I need? And it really, if someone's alone in a room writing books from their imagination, they might think it's simple. But for people who are engaged with the world, it requires constant, not ad nauseum. That would be another kind of misalignment. If we're constantly focused on fixing everything to
vigilant, hyper vigilant nervous system.
But there's something of a flow, and it's hard to be perfect. As much as it's difficult as someone who grew up in this era in the West to say there's a time for violence or a time for war, there is something very legitimate about what you're saying. What do you call a country without an army? A former country, right? Or without any kind of defense. Like this is, unfortunately, we live in a world that more than just saints inhabit. We have other kinds of, I think I've heard you use the word asuras.
Yes.
And so asur in Hebrew, just a fun overlap of sound. I don't know if they share a common origin, but asur means forbidden, or literally tied up, like to tie something or to bind it. So the bound ones, the ones who are twisted in their egos, could be called asuras in Hebrew.
That is so fascinating, because actually the devas and the asuras are those whose ego is leading, and devas are those whose ego is serving them, the higher order.
Yeah.
And
I
so,
like that.
You were mentioning how even your last name, Ponak, is somewhere has an interesting connection with India.
Yeah. So at some point, my ancestors, probably in Poland or something like that, adopted a last name that was Poniachik. And that was later changed to Ponak to be shortened to be comprehensible and writable for people here. But Poniachik means those who trade with the Punjab. So some of my ancestors going way back were part of some kind of trade route with India, which I think is amazing. And it's just one of the many overlaps I found in my own lineage and family with the Indian subcontinent.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating. One of the gurus who have highly influenced my lineage, Swami Ramtirth, was a lion from the Punjab. So who knows what was happening there?
There seemed to
in
be
ancient
some
times.
routes of communication. Yeah, there seemed to be some routes of communication between teachers and teachings.
Oh,
Sufism
yes.
has some roots or influences out of India, and Sufism was influencing Jewish mystics in the Middle Ages. And we get some metaphors there are metaphors used in Tibetan Buddhism that are used in medieval Jewish mysticism, for example. And there's a connection point between those called India. Even I heard you translate the word Veda, and literally, could you tell me what that means? And maybe it's more of a W sound than a V sound?
No, it is a V sound, actually. The Veda comes from the root vid, V-I-D. It's a V sound, which means to be aware of that.
Be aware. So we have a word in Hebrew that has a root that is Vav Daled Ayin, could be pronounced Vada, Wada, Yodea, but it means knowledge or awareness. Da'at is one of the, sometimes it's like this mysterious 11th Sifirah in the Tree of Life. And Da'at, from that root, it's very similar, has to do with not just awareness and knowledge, but a kind of uniting knowledge.
Yeah.
To know something is to become one with it. The knower and the known.
Yes. So the to be aware is not the ordinary sense of awareness, but the awareness that ends divisibility in the awareness, the unity consciousness. That is
Yes,
what
exactly.
it represents.
And I use the term unity consciousness when I describe da'at, this sense of knowledge or awareness, with a similar root. I'm not, let's say, a brazen person when it comes to history to say there must be a connection, but it's always interesting to find out.
It is interesting, yes.
I grew up with Jewish people in my community around my age who were from India and whose family line goes back there for thousands of years. The story they tell is there was a shipwreck because the Indian Ocean connects into the Red Sea, which connects into ancient Israel and modern Israel. And they believe that they were originally survivors of a shipwreck, and they lived in a very good way in India for thousands of years. And I've heard some say it is the only country where Jews have lived ever where there was no anti-Semitism.
And there is still no anti-Semitism, because even now, the communities of the Jews, known as the Yehudis in North India, where I come from, they continue to survive and practice their ways. And in our stories and in our folklore, the Yehudis come in as very devoted and devotional people in their own, in their own inner being, with their own version of their spirituality. But they were respected, and they were often merchants, and they were also successful and charitable people. And they were never asked to convert, because not to like blow your horn, if that's the way, but I'm proud that India is the only country that never had imperialistic ambitions towards another country. It has never for the longest time, I'm not speaking about today, but in general, in a history, there is a great tolerance for all traditions, because I think the underlying truth in the Vedic truth of oneness still exists. Even when I was growing up, God for me was not just in my temple, but say I was traveling and I went to the Gurudwara, the Sikh temple in Amritsar, I would feel the same experience. When I was in South India in Chennai, the nearest God house was a church and built by Saint Thomas, and I went there regularly. So for us, the experience of that unity consciousness could happen in nature, could happen in our home altar, and could happen in any church, any house of God. And this is not like a unique experience because I'm Acharya Shunya. This happens rampantly in India across the everyday people. Politics is different, and political leaders don't want us to be united necessarily. But the general experience in India is of respect and love. And I grew up with a Yehudi family, and they had their own foods and their own traditions that we were respecting, and they were respecting ours. It was really beautiful.
Yehudi means Judahite in Hebrew. It's like that's where the word Jew comes from. We're of the tribe of Judah, which is one of the 12 tribes of ancient Israel. Yes. And so Yehudi or Yehudi is a Hebrew word. It means Jew in English.
There you go.
That's you knew some Hebrew already.
And I ate some Hebrew food also when I would visit their family. It felt different and was very delicious. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's different food traditions and different cultures. So one of the things you're reminding me of, which may be a similarity or maybe a difference between the Vedic tradition and Torah or Judaism or Kabbalah, is there is both this sense of the unitive experience and the multiplicity in that. There's different, I guess, colors and shades that come through. So if the exploration of the yes in the shadow and the light, the chesed energy, is a conceptual or a virtues-based way of looking at it, an experiential way to look at something like that is in introspection or meditation. That I work with people, for example, using body-based meditation. And sometimes we feel things in our bodies that are not so lovely to feel. It might be a constriction of some kind in our chest or our belly. This is a normal part of human reality. These can be doorways and gateways for exploration. And often what it involves is going into the shadow, that descent for the sake of hopefully ascent. It requires that process of trust and being with it and trying to see it clearly. And when we do, something can shift. It's not only is it an awareness, an understanding, there's actually sometimes people experience a change in the essence of that constriction. And it'll maybe physically or emotionally, it starts to open. And in a moment like that, if we stay with that feeling and that process, sometimes we can be blessed with what feel like visitations from the Sefirot. That chesed, this sense of a love beyond our normal conventional sense of love, or a gevura experience, a sense of a strength and a firmness that isn't of our own doing or making. It's not angry or guilting. It burns clean. That kind of boundary. There's a divine quality that can arise. So in as much as the Kabbalistic system lays out ideas for our reflection and refining of our actions, I believe the system itself is derived from these kinds of experiences where people look inwards. Maybe it's into the shadow or maybe it's into the light, but in that process, there's an invitation to something to arise from beyond.
That so many lights go on, and indeed, the real process, the real journey begins when we are willing to close our eyes and look inwards. And that is why in our tradition, the Vedic sage had so many questions. So then what did they do? They sat down and they closed their eyes and they went inwards. And a whole sojourn begins. And I really like your hinting at the fact that there is then not only inner clarity, the seeing unlocks the lock, because who is seeing is a greater awareness. But then there might be help from other layers of reality, so to say. In your case, it is those 10 levels. And I really do believe that there is a coming together of the seeing and then the grace that happens. We call it anugraha, where when we become willing to be with the shadow, it's not like we're just experiencing trauma after trauma after trauma, but when you're in a spiritual way, being willing to be with the shadow. That shadow was to begin with never a punishment. It was never really a sin. It was the very doorway through which God awaits us. And at least in my own life, Matthew, I was carrying my own shadows, my own shame. It's enough to be a woman on earth to have shame, no matter what culture. And then you had your own experiences. And when I just sat with it rather than trying to fix it, and I was able to be with it without pushing it away, without trying to diagnose it and do some medical work on it, just be okay with it and be and to hold it with a awareness that this is not just a sack full of darkness that I want to do away with. I was like, this is a teacher. At that time, the teaching came in, and it really did feel for me at that time that it's external. At this point, I cannot say if it rose from within me or if it was external. But I did have a very specific moment of being contacted. That really happened to me by the higher Devic, in our case, Devic. How you have the dark and the shadow and the light in those 10 levels. I got contacted by devas, and there is a before that contact me, and there is an after that contact me. So there's help in this universe.
Yeah. There's a show from the late 90s and early 2000s that apparently got its name from an earlier philosophical essay. And the show is Will and Grace. If you know that, it was a TV show. It's about two people named Will and Grace. But the concept of our willful action, the things that we do to set the context, and then the grace which may arise as part of help on that journey. That's, I think, a very universal kind of teaching. And I resonate a lot with what you're describing in different ways, in different language, in different, perhaps, modes of communication or transmission. But it's important to know as teachers, too, that we can help set a context for people. But the work of transformation is not ultimately up to us.
Yes, absolutely. And so we have this these two words in our two things. One is sadhana, which is our effort, the effort that we put into our spiritual work. And then the other is jnana, or liberating knowledge that arises, but it doesn't arise only due to effort. 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 could be 1 billion, 1 million something, because of this endowment, sacred endowment that we receive. And so liberation happens not just in the mathematics of effort, but in the grace that descends or ascends. I don't know. So I know that you have this repair work that happens in the Kabbalah, right? Is it tikkun?
That's one term for it. Yeah, tikkun.
Okay. Can you talk more about like a sadhana perspective, like the effort versus the endowment, something like that? Is there something like that in
and I think in ways I've I've been pointing in that direction
Yes.
a little bit, where
Point again. We are
someone
beginners.
say, if in a practice of one of the, you could call it a meditation, but you could also call it a prayer practice, it from the Eastern European mystical lineage known as Hasidism. And this practice it's pretty simple, actually. It's about going out into some kind of seclusion, into nature, ideally, but even in your room, and pouring your heart out to God. It's because the teaching is presented in the context of it's actually really good to be happy, but it's also really hard to do that all the time. So take some time aside every day and just be real. It's not always so easy in our society to find the context for being real. This teaching comes before Sigmund Freud, before therapy is invented. And this is a Hasidic master, fairly young, saying, every day for an hour, I go out, often at night, into the field, and I let it all out. I break my heart open for God. And in an experience like that, that practice, that intention setting, I'm going to go out for an hour or whatever it is, however often each day, each week, and I'm going to be really real. And if I feel like crying, I'm going to cry. And if I feel like screaming, I'm going to scream. And if I feel like saying loving things, I'm going to say loving things, but I'm going to pour my soul out. In fact, the book about this is called The Outpouring of the Soul. So that is a kind of willful effort. Anyone who does that practice or similar practices will know that if you're expecting to see the light of God every single day, you might be disappointed. It might not happen. And that's actually part of the practice is the practice. It's just doing it, as we say in our tradition, for its own sake, lishma, that the goal in practice is to not have expectations. And ironically or magically, what happens is the more sincerely we do practices without asking anything for return, it creates a context in which that grace is more likely to arise. Consistent effort, freely given, if you will, freely practiced without expectations of rewards, just because it's a valuable thing to do. Every so often, the Holy Blessed One comes to visit us.
It's beautiful. So as we come towards the last segment of our conversation, I open the field for you, Matthew, if you would like to share something with our speakers. I'm sure they are really not only delighting with the depths of what you're talking about, but then also I wouldn't say similarity, but the similarity of intention for us to be okay in our multiplicity, but yet to be held by our unity. And that is definitely the intention of two ancient traditions, the Kabbalah and the Advaita. And both of these are philosophical emergences from an older tradition. For you, it was Judaism, and for Advaita, it was Sanatana Dharma, not even Hinduism, because Hinduism is more of a common, a more modern version of another emergence from Sanatana Dharma. So Sanatana Dharma and its principles, more people know. Advaita, lesser people know. And I assume that's the same for Kabbalah. But in these last 5 to 10 minutes, I'm sure there is something pure and beautiful that you can leave our speakers with, whether it's a guided meditation, whether it is a reflection from your heart that can help people. Specifically, I have an ask for you that can help people in these turbulent times when knowledge of the Kabbalah, knowledge of Advaita is not what they're turning to, but they might just listen to this podcast. They might be in their car, they might be doing their housework, and, they get to have this podcast as a ray of light for them, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Well, Thank you for that invitation, Shunya. And there are two elements I wanna frame and offer as a hope and a framework for this busy life and these uncertain times we find ourselves in. One of them is we both come from traditions that involve some degree of text study. And we both have spent a lot of time, probably you more than me, learning ancient mythic epics. One of the things that we find is there are certain lines in these stories, certain chapters or framings that get a lot of commentary on. There are people who spend time saying, oh, what this really means is, and they give little footnotes, or they try to flesh it out into something more digestible. And that is a process that happens when we study ancient texts and try to find meaning in them. There's some things that are immediately beautiful, and there's things that give us pause. And those things that give us pause allows us to enter in more deeply. Those are invitations in the texts themselves. And because of that, through that kind of learning, we can develop this instinct and this capacity to say, if something's difficult or confusing, it doesn't need to send me away or cause me to get bitter. It's actually a doorway, something that I can go farther into. In Kabbalah, one of the understandings is that our world is a sacred text. And in that same way, there's the literal reading that we encounter through our five senses. But just like those troubling verses we can find in text, when things come our way that are challenging, if we feel resourced, that can be an invitation to go deeper into them and to really grapple with the challenge there and to see, well, it turns out there's actually some light there. There's a tikkun moment, a reparation, a transformation that's possible when we engage with life as a sacred text. Thank you. Yeah. The second piece I want to say is, in our tradition, there's a big emphasis on the balance between the work and the rest, the work and the celebration of our world, because at any moment we can choose to delve into the shadow. It will always be there. We can also at any moment choose to celebrate and to be grateful for all we have. And amidst all of the uncertainty in our world, there is so much bounty. There is so much to be thankful for. And so whether that's taking a day a week, like our traditional practitioners would, to really try to come to a place with the best food and taking a break from the news and saying prayers of gratitude, to feel like our world is beautiful. That's kind of the goal emotionally, is to get to that place. We could also do that for 30 minutes in the evening, light a candle and just listen to what you really need. Do you need a nap? You need to eat, you go for a walk, you see your friend, whatever it is. Can we find ways of knowing when it's time to face the challenging verses that come our way in our world, and times where we can say, no, I'm just going to focus on what's delightful and good and nourishing, to find that balance that I believe we all need in some way.
This gives so much permission for self-love and self-care. It's exactly what we need. This is really restful, and I really hope that our listeners develop some kind of spiritual time and ritual for these kind of practices. Thank you so much, Matthew, for sharing this. And as we wind up, I'm sure our speakers would love to buy your books and find you and your website. So maybe that's something you can share.
Yes. If you go to MatthewPonak.com, MatthewPonak.com, you could see my books and other offerings that I'm doing right now. You could also see if you follow me on Facebook or Instagram, Rabbi Matthew Ponak, and I share a lot of videos and posts information about Kabbalah. And I have a course I just put up on udemy.com, udemy.com. You can find through my Facebook or Instagram. And it's an introduction to Jewish mysticism that focuses on a lot of the topics we discussed today. Thank you very much for having me on your show, Acharya Shunya.
Yes, thank you for being on the show. It is a whole another joy to speak to a scholar of another tradition. And so you get to share your tradition, but you also get to learn about the other tradition. And it has ignited a lifelong curiosity. And thank you so much for being on the show here on Shadow to Self. Speakers, this is Acharya Shunya signing off. Until next time.
If you loved this episode, there's a way to show your love. Just go to acharyashunya.com and make a donation to support the production of this podcast. You can also rate, review, and share this episode with others, live on YouTube every month. Browse her online wisdom school for her latest course offerings, and thanks for listening.